defendant begged you to have his baby, but then disappeared when you told him you were pregnant. And his fiance that he is your son's father. And Miss Simmons wants you to take care of another man's baby.
And everything, and the first day I did come to the house, we did have sex on the first day.
Did you use protection?
We was using condoms, but they kept breaking, so we stopped using condoms.
Okay. If you were having sex and the condom kept breaking, how is it that you can definitively say you are not Malachi's biological father? How often did you have sex, Miss Simmons?
We was always having sex.
In this powerful courtroom narrative, the tension begins the moment the doors open, and each individual steps into Judge Lake's courtroom carrying their own version of the truth. What unfolds is not simply a paternity dispute. It is a living study of the relationship between law and justice, the emotional cost of secrets, and the painful clarity that comes when the truth is finally forced into the open. The cases brought forward feel like a blend of real-life testimonies, legal theories, and human regret, almost as if the stories were shaped by the same raw honesty found in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, or the hard discussions often heard on the Divorce Course podcast and the Game-Changing Attorney podcast, where accountability cannot be avoided. From the very beginning, Judge Lake stands not just as a legal authority but as the interpreter of truth, as someone who knows firsthand that while the law creates structure, justice can only emerge when evidence is acknowledged, voices are heard, and emotional wounds are confronted. This is the heartbeat of the courtroom and the theme that shapes everything that follows. Each participant arrives believing their story is the correct one. But as the evidence unfolds, the courtroom becomes a place where the concept of justice in jurisprudence is not an abstract idea. It is lived moment by moment. The central case revolves around a young mother who insists that the man sitting across from her is the father of her child. She describes him as a man who once begged her to have his baby, who spoke passionately about wanting a daughter, and who told her he was ready to step into fatherhood. But shortly after she revealed her pregnancy, she claims he disappeared, emotionally, physically, and financially. Her testimony is marked with a mixture of exhaustion and determination, a combination often seen in test cheating stories shared online, where someone is left alone with questions they never wanted to ask. On the other side, the alleged father stands rigid, insisting that the truth is far more complicated than what she is presenting. He argues that their relationship was nothing more than a brief fling, that she spent time with other men, and that he has always had doubts about whether the child is biologically his. His current sits behind him, her expression guarded, her body tense, as she listens to accusations and personal details spilling across the courtroom. In her mind, this case is more than a paternity dispute. It is a threat to her relationship, her dignity, and her future. She is determined to defend herself and the man she plans to marry. What transforms this case from ordinary to extraordinary is the way Judge Lake handles the emotional chaos. She reminds the parties that the courtroom is not a playground for accusations, but an environment shaped by facts and evidence. At one point, she reminds everyone that adverse inference in Evidence Act principles exist exactly for situations where someone hides, avoids, or manipulates evidence. In other words, withholding the truth can legally hurt you. These reminders serve as constant warnings that law does not reward those who distort their stories. The young woman remains firm that she was never involved with anyone else, and that she has always told the alleged father the truth about her pregnancy. She explains that her family was present when she took the pregnancy test, that she sent him the picture instantly, and that he comforted her the moment she cried over the fear of becoming a young mother. She recalls him telling her that God knows what he's doing, words that now feel hollow after his sudden disappearance. She describes a painful moment, 1 month after telling him the news, when she showed up at his apartment only to find he had already left town. His neighbors informed her he had gone to Alabama. What she sees as abandonment, he describes as complicated timing. He insists that the woman he was with at the time, now his, was the only person he truly committed to, and that he was trying to repair that relationship. His testimony brings an entirely different layer to the narrative. She explains with frustration that she found out about the young woman after reading suspicious messages on his phone. She admits she confronted him, called the number, and had an explosive conversation with the mother of the child. She argues that she was disrespected and forced into the role of defending a relationship that suddenly felt unstable and exposed. Her protective instinct is clear. She wants her life, her home, and her future unthreatened by another woman's claim on her partner. Judge Lake listens to all of this with the depth of someone who has heard thousands of similar stories, stories where mistakes, confusion, and half-told truths collide with parental responsibilities. She brings a Supreme Court-level seriousness to the discussion whenever child support and parental obligations arise, emphasizing repeatedly that the child at the center of the case did not ask to be born into confusion. She makes it clear that once the truth is revealed through a test, no adult will be allowed to shrug their responsibilities. For many people, test people regret taking because it collapses illusions, but in the courtroom, Judge Lake stresses that regret cannot change biology, and biology cannot be negotiated. Throughout the hearing, emotions rise. The mother becomes tearful when describing how alone she felt during the pregnancy. The alleged father becomes defensive when accused of lying about his commitments. His becomes agitated whenever the mother questions her character. It is a courtroom filled with voices overlapping, hearts reacting, and pride clashing against accountability. And yet Judge Lake continues to bring the attention back to stability, truth, and justice. As the hearing progresses, deeper truths emerge, truths about fear, insecurity, the consequences of unprotected relationships, and the burdens that fall when two people create life without planning for the emotional, financial, and moral responsibilities that follow. The narrative begins to resemble certain adoption stories' full episodes, where people must face the aftermath of their earlier choices and either step up or step back in ways that reshape entire lives. When Judge Lake finally turns to the envelope containing the DNA test, the room shifts. The tension becomes so thick it feels like the air changes. Judge Lake reminds them that truth changes everything, and that in her courtroom, truth is not just evidence. It is the foundation for rebuilding broken trust, broken families, and broken expectations. The results determine whether the man is indeed the father, whether the must now accept a permanent connection between her future husband and another woman, and whether the mother will gain the validation and support she has demanded since the beginning. The entire courtroom seems to hold its breath as Judge Lake prepares to reveal the truth that will reshape every relationship in the room. As the atmosphere in Judge Lake's courtroom tightens around the impending DNA result, something deeper becomes visible, a portrait of the modern family breaking apart under pressure, a portrait shaped by broken trust, half-truths, and emotional wounds. The courtroom becomes less about blame and more about accountability. What everyone realizes, even if they don't say it out loud, is that they are standing in the middle of a life-altering moment, one that echoes the themes often explored in the Divorce Course podcast or the cautionary stories shared in test cheating stories, where relationships crumble because truth refused to stay hidden. Judge Lake firmly reminds everyone that this courtroom is not merely a stage for arguments. It is part of a system designed to merge both the relationship between law and justice. She acts as both a legal interpreter and an emotional anchor, ensuring that even the most heated voices are redirected toward resolution and honesty. This is the part of jurisprudence where the concept of justice stops being theoretical and becomes painfully personal. For the young mother, justice means recognition. For the alleged father, justice means clarity. For the justice means protection of her dignity. For the child, justice means stability and truth. But before getting to that truth, Judge Lake revisits the crucial inconsistencies and emotional gaps in the testimonies. She asks the mother to explain why she believes the man begged her to have his baby. The mother recalls conversations where he expressed a desire for another child, specifically a daughter, and how he convinced her that he was emotionally ready for that responsibility. To her, these were not casual comments, they were commitments. She says she felt chosen, valued, and aligned with a man who presented himself as ready to build a family. Judge Lake then turns to the alleged father, urging him to explain the contradictions. He hesitates, shifting between guilt and defensiveness. He admits that he said emotional things he wasn't prepared to act on. He admits he told her there was no need for a DNA test at first because he didn't want to upset her. But he also insists that he had silent doubts from the beginning. In his view, their connection was too brief and too unstable to be certain. His nods with quiet frustration, seeing his admissions as too late, too shallow, and far too expensive emotionally. In that moment, Judge Lake doesn't shy away from confronting hard truths. She reminds the alleged father that emotional irresponsibility carries consequences just as real as physical abandonment. Words said in vulnerable moments can shape people's lives, especially when those words involve promises of family and future. She points out how easily misunderstandings grow in relationships shaped by impulse rather than intention. Her reminders carry the clarity often heard in recovery-based discussions or celebrate recovery testimonies, where individuals confront their flaws in the light of brutal honesty. The mother then explains more deeply the months of pregnancy that followed. She recalls the emotional confusion of being young, newly pregnant, and terrified. She describes going through doctor's appointments, preparing for birth, and facing the exhaustion of late pregnancy, alone. She talks about crying herself to sleep sometimes, wondering whether the man who promised to be there would ever return. To her, the silence felt like betrayal. And yet she also remembers moments of hope, times she believed he would show up again, apologize, and take responsibility. The alleged father provides his own perspective. He claims he left town to rebuild his relationship with the woman who is now his. He insists that the timing of the pregnancy announcement and the breakup of his previous relationship clashed in a way that overwhelmed him. He didn't know how to juggle the emotional fallout, the accusations, the doubts, and the constant pressure from everyone around him. He says he was trying to save his future, not run from responsibility. But Judge Lake immediately reminds him that saving your future never excuses abandoning your obligations, especially when the potential consequence is a human child. His, meanwhile, becomes emotional as she recounts the moment she discovered the truth. She remembers scrolling through his phone and finding the messages from the young woman, the ones referencing pregnancy, missed calls, and unanswered questions. She recalls the shock of realizing her partner was living a double life. She explains how she immediately confronted the situation, how the mother's responses were defensive, emotional, and explosive, and how she felt attacked by someone who had entered her life without warning. Her voice cracks when she describes the fear that her relationship might crumble under the weight of betrayal. Judge Lake listens with her trademark depth, balancing compassion with clarity. She acknowledges this pain but reminds her that the mother's defensiveness stemmed from fear and abandonment, not rivalry. She explains that in cases involving pregnancy, loneliness magnifies every insecurity, and confusion turns into emotional desperation. Judge Lake highlights that the courtroom must focus not on past hostility, but on moving forward with maturity, a theme often emphasized in legal episodes or adoption stories full episodes, where adults must learn to cooperate regardless of past harm. The conversation then turns toward legal responsibility. Judge Lake reminds the alleged father that if the DNA test proves he is the biological dad, child support becomes a legal obligation, one that aligns with the expectations of both state law and even Supreme Court-level precedents that emphasize the protection of minors. She explains how deeply the law values biological connection and that financial responsibility cannot be avoided simply because relationships become complicated. She references the importance of establishing paternity for the child's well-being, especially regarding health care, schooling, and future support. As she speaks, the courtroom becomes quiet. Everyone begins to truly absorb what the impending truth means. The atmosphere mirrors the emotional intensity found in Truth Changes Everything moments on podcasts or documentaries, where people finally face the consequences of long-avoided truths. The young mother wipes tears away. The alleged father's face tenses. The crosses her arms, bracing for emotional impact. Judge Lake then explores the timeline in greater detail. She examines the allegations about frequency of intimacy, the issue of the condoms breaking, and the references to knowing your body, which sparked early disagreements about the plausibility of the pregnancy's timing. She analytically notes that the confusion around the dates, combined with the young man's disappearance, fueled uncertainty for everyone involved. She reiterates the significance of the evidence principle. When facts are unclear, DNA testing becomes the ultimate equalizer. She also mentions the nuances of legal interpretation, referencing the adverse inference in evidence act, explaining that when someone avoids communication or disappears during critical moments, such as pregnancy, courts often question their intentions. She reminds the alleged father that his absence created more suspicion than clarity, and this suspicion is reflected in his emotional reactions as well. The mother continues describing the aftermath of the birth. She recounts holding her newborn son in her arms and wondering how she would raise him alone. She explains how she debated reaching out again, but felt exhausted by the emotional roller coaster. She says she wanted her child to eventually know his father, if the father was willing to know him in return. Her voice is steady but emotional, the same tone one might hear in heartfelt courtroom episodes or deep confessional moments. Judge Lake then shifts her attention to the broader legal and ethical context of paternity cases. She notes that modern society is filled with tests people regret taking, where individuals run from the truth until the truth finds them. She points out that many adults do not understand the weight of parenthood until they are confronted with scientific evidence. She speaks about how technology has changed the landscape of parental disputes, how DNA results now force honesty where avoidance once existed, and how every adult in this case must accept the reality that a child's life, not their pride, is what matters most. Before the truth is revealed, the courtroom undergoes a moment of emotional stillness. The alleged father stares at the floor, as if rehearsing the two possible futures waiting for him. The stiffens, preparing to either accept a new family dynamic or breathe a sigh of relief. The mother braces herself, hoping the months of abandonment will finally be validated. And then Judge Lake, with years of experience guiding her voice, prepares to open the envelope. The tension is almost unbearable, because in this moment, every life in the room is about to change, and everyone knows it. The entire courtroom sits suspended in silence as Judge Lake holds the envelope, an object so small in size, yet so enormous in consequence. Every individual present knows that what lies inside will either confirm their fears or relieve them, but more importantly, it will end months of emotional exhaustion. This is the moment that perfectly captures the phrase "truth changes everything," because what Judge Lake is about to reveal will permanently reshape every relationship in the room. Before announcing the results, Judge Lake takes a measured breath and speaks directly to the young parents. She explains that the judicial system is not simply a series of cold rules, but a living framework built to protect the vulnerable, in this case, a child who deserves answers. She talks briefly about how the relationship between law and justice requires courage from the adults involved. Law can demand a DNA test, but justice demands emotional accountability afterward. The two cannot exist separately, a point often emphasized in legal discussions or interviews on the Game Changing Attorney podcast, where the emotional burden of truth meets the rigidity of legal responsibility. The mother sits with her hands clenched, praying silently for the validation she has sought since the day she found out she was pregnant. For her, this isn't about winning, it's about being heard, believed, and supported. She has carried the emotional and financial weight alone, and now she is ready for the truth to confirm what she has always known in her heart. The alleged father stares at the ground, his mind racing with every possible outcome. His doubt has consumed him for months, fueled by assumptions, timing issues, and rumors. He remembers every argument with every night lying awake wondering whether he is biologically connected to this child. He knows that if the results confirm paternity, every excuse he has made will become irrelevant, and all the avoidance will no longer matter. His future will carry an additional responsibility, one that cannot be walked away from. He swallows hard, bracing himself for whatever truth emerges.